It is history's most haunting and hostile arena. An empire of sand and sun, with a past as captivating as its landscape.
The Sahara Desert forces people to either use their ingenuity or perish.
Here, kings led caravans of 30,000 camels, bearing riches beyond imagining.
He was so free with his gold that he actually destabilized the economy of Egypt for a decade afterwards.
Here, Roman soldiers exterminated the citizens of the empire's most bitter rival.
The people tried to defend their houses, which are flanking these streets, and they were killed one after the other.
Slaves trudged the scorching sands into a waking nightmare.
When people on this hideous death march could not go on, oftentimes they were simply beheaded.
A brash American led the Marines on a perilous mission to the shores of Tripoli.
The plan is almost insane. It's so ambitious.
And the misfits who joined the Foreign Legion forged a legend in last stands and lost causes.
One company got cut off entirely by these Arab horsemen who came out of this blinding sandstorm.
Explore a land of mirage and myth, from a mountain fortress of ancient freedom fighters to a vast stadium stained by gladiators' gore, to the fabled metropolis of Timbuktu. "525 years before Christ, a mighty army advanced across the vast Sahara and into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Persia's king, Cambyses, had led 40,000 warriors in a daring invasion of Egypt. After conquering the city of Thebes, they set off to destroy the temple of Amun at the oasis of Siwa, a 625-mile march across the forbidding desert. As the Persians paused for a midday meal, they had no inkling that fate was about to derail their mission in the most cataclysmic fashion imaginable. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, a violent wind ignited a sandstorm of monstrous proportions. The soldiers were engulfed by a deluge of sand. Herodotus wrote that the wind drove the sand over them in heaps so that they disappeared forever. Historians still debate the credibility of Herodotus's account, questioning whether any sandstorm could bury a force of 40,000. But to this day, no trace of Cambyses' army has been discovered. Such are the mysteries of the Sahara. Exuding a power born of its vastness, radiating an allure born of its beauty, the Sahara is a wilderness without peer. Here, nature has crafted a world of mesmerizing desolation. And here, from the Stone Age to the 21st century, humanity has dared to carve history.
This place, this I like very much because in the desert, very far, everything is free. I have my liberty. very, very, very nice for me, for my life.
There's something about humans that makes us insist on knowing our place in the universe, particularly at night on those dunes, surrounded by infinity. You feel like a small speck, but you have this overwhelming sense of your place in the universe.
I've never been so at peace with myself and the world as when I'm out there. You can sit there and see forever. Not a damn soul. It's hard to find that in the world today.
There's something about the experience of living in such a seemingly sterile environment. It seems as though there's nothing there, and yet there's such a vibrancy which is beneath the surface.
It's an incredibly powerful place. It's very harsh and often hostile, can be very dangerous, but it's also incredibly beautiful.
The Sahara appears as a great scorched blister on the Earth's surface. Only the North and South poles are brighter. It blankets 3.5 million square miles, stretching across 11 nations in North and Central Africa, an area nearly as large as the continental United States.
The Sahara is enormous. You can travel for day after day after day across the Sahara and see precisely nothing. Native Saharans say that Allah stripped all the life and the trees and the vegetation out of the Sahara to give Allah peace, so he'd have somewhere to walk in quiet so he could think.
Muslims call the Sahara the Garden of Allah. In its majestic emptiness, they find union with the divine. Others revel in the Sahara's more earthly indulgences. For all, the great desert is an unyielding world whose most telling measure is its searing heat. No place on the planet is hotter. In September 1922, the temperature hit a record 136 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade.
When the weather is hot, we don't like it at all. All one can do is wear light clothes.
In the sun, only God knows how hot it can get. Easily the temperature would rise above 150. You can come out, break an egg on the hood of your car, and it would turn into an omelet. It is that hot.
It does rain in the Sahara. This is one of the extraordinary things. The native Saharans often tell stories of torrential downpours, but it's so hot, it never hits the ground. They never feel the water. It flash evaporates above their heads. It's that hot.
The sweltering air baking the Sahara is rarely still. The wind here has many names: Harmattan, Habub, Ghibli, and Khamsin. It can reach speeds of up to 90 miles per hour, powering sandstorms of hurricane force, like the tempest said to have engulfed the Persian army. The ferocious storms blacken the skies for up to 4 days, whipping up dust as far away as Greenland and beyond. The persistent winds are the architects of the desert's signature features, its breathtaking dunes. Some tower as high as a 50-story skyscraper above the desert floor. They are a wonder not only to the eye, but also the ear, as they sometimes boom, whistle, or sing. Scientists have managed to record their haunting emanations.
I have heard the sand dunes actually sing, if that is the right term to use. To me, it sounded more like someone blowing on the top of a bottle. But of course, the imagination of the people in the desert can stretch that booming or whistling to a complete speech. In fact, the Arabs believe that there are creatures that are invisible, that they live in the desert, are called the jinn. And these genies or jinns are supposed to be invisible, and yet they talk to people.
Deep beneath the Sahara's dunes lies the precious resource that has powered the march of history here. In isolated pockets of the desert, it surges with life-giving force to the surface. At the oasis of Tamarza in Tunisia, water is cherished not only as the fountain of life, but also as the elixir of the soul. Tamarza is one of dozens of large oases that tap vast subterranean reservoirs, holding a volume of water rivaling that of America's Great Lakes. The reservoirs, called aquifers, are the result of ancient rainfall trapped for thousands of years. Nearly 2,000 miles from Tamarza is Siwa, the Egyptian oasis that the Persians never reached. For centuries, farmers here have relied on 200 individual springs to sustain their families and water their groves.
And each spring is divided into 24 hours. Each person has several hours from each spring. And from these springs, the sea will irrigate all their land, dates and olives. You can't grow anything without water.
Siwa is a green island of life in a sea of desolation, an enticing trace of the Sahara's altogether different past. Frieze frames of a bygone world adorn rock formations throughout the vast desert, crafted by the vanished cultures that dwelt here beginning 8,000 years ago. The ancient paintings and carvings depict a green and lush Sahara, a fertile savanna teeming with life.
They're astonishing. They are so vivid. They show elephants, giraffe, gazelles, hippopotamus. Hippopotamus, if you think about it, in the middle of the Sahara. It's quite a thing. The Sahara obviously was a much wetter place.
Additional remnants of the Sahara's lost world are now being unearthed by archaeologists.
We have evidence from pollen of plants that can't live in the desert today. You can find things like freshwater snail shells, fish bones, the bones of hippopotamus, crocodile, and throughout the desert we can find the remains of other animals as well.
Another bit of information that we have is satellite imagery. You can see that the Sahara was just a patchwork of old rivers, of lakes, of swamps. In fact, there's almost no part of the Sahara that wasn't more water-based than sand-based.
It was more like the type of landscape you'd find in southern Africa. You could have taken a safari through the Sahara between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. So it was actually a very, very abundant environment, and it supported a large human population.
Stone Age cultures thrived in the green Sahara by harvesting the grains that grew wild along the lakes. They hunted the plentiful wildlife and fished in the teeming rivers. About 7,000 years ago, ancient Saharans began settling in small villages and domesticating cattle and sheep. Scientists believe that the lush Sahara these people called home was the result of cyclical changes in the Earth's tilt and its orbit. Over the eons, these changes have caused the Sahara to alternate between savanna and desert. The Sahara last turned green some 10,000 years ago when these cycles combined to bathe the Sahara in brighter and longer sunlight than it gets today.
Now, you would have thought that if you have more sunlight, then you'd have a hotter, drier climate, but the way that the Earth's climate works is just the opposite. What that does is to cause more upwelling in the atmosphere that drags in the monsoon rains from the south.
After it fell, the abundant monsoon rains watering the Sahara evaporated, helping to keep the region cool. Water contained in the Sahara's moist vegetation also evaporated under the bright sun, forming rain clouds. A powerful feedback loop perpetuated itself. The Sahara's plentiful plant life generated more rain, which in turn produced thicker vegetation. As the seasonal rains watered the green Sahara, the pastoral cultures dependent on them could view nature as their benevolent ally. Nature, however, was about to suddenly turn their idyllic world upside down. Over the course of several thousand years, the Earth's tilt and its orbit each shifted toward the positions they hold today. This diminished the Sahara's sunlight, weakening its monsoons and triggering an abrupt reversal of the feedback loop that had kept the Sahara green.
Now, once this vegetation system collapses, you have very, very rapid increases in aridity, rapid desertification. So probably within the space of one person's lifetime, there would have been dramatic changes and areas would have become uninhabitable.
Lake Chad, which once flooded a region larger than Texas, shriveled to an area the size of Vermont. Barrenness spread like wildfire.
I think that when those droughts came, they came with ferocity and suddenly. It was a traumatic event for the people.
In a span of only 300 years, the green Sahara was consumed by Earth's largest, hottest, and harshest desert.
It would have been devastating. People in that situation would have had two choices, either to stay put and die or to move.
The Sahara's abundant wildlife began an epic exodus from the hostile new environment. They were joined by many of the region's ancient tribes who retreated to Central Africa's grasslands or north toward the Mediterranean Sea.
A lot of people migrated to the Nile Valley, and it appears that this process of profound social change that happened as a result, a direct result of the desiccation of the Sahara, played a very important role in the emergence of Egyptian society, for example, and the rise of the pharaonic civilization.
If we look at all primary civilizations on Earth, they have come into being by being threatened by a desert. That they started with an environment which was much more benign, but as the climate changed and the deserts became deserts, these territories like Sahara, forces people to either use their ingenuity or perish. There is no third option. And in order to do that, they needed an organization. So in a way, we owe our civilizations to the advancing deserts.
Thousands of intrepid tribesmen swept up in the savannah's catastrophic collapse chose a course fraught with peril. They chose to stay in the Sahara and forge a rugged new way of life. A 1,000 years before Christ, Earth's newest desert dominated a landscape where hippos once waded in lakes and tribesmen drove cattle. All that remained of the vast savanna were a few scattered pockets of pasture land, soon to wither in the sweltering heat. But even in this sun-scorched wilderness, Africans and outsiders alike would author bold new chapters in history. During this era, in what is now Libya, one innovative tribe stood apart. In the lowlands of a region called the Wadi al-Ajal, near a stony plateau known as the Hamada Marzouk, the Garamantes reigned supreme from their capital, Garama.
The Garamantes arose as these pastoral groups, these sort of prehistoric populations, responded to this increased aridity by developing ever more ingenious ways of getting at the water, the diminishing water supplies. And as the water level became lower and lower, they actually developed a very, very sophisticated irrigation technology based on underground irrigation channels known locally as foggera. And these would tap the elevated water table in the higher regions of the landscape and channel this, gravity feed it to the lower levels where it would be used for agriculture.
As the Garamantes ruled the Sahara, an enterprising people from the Middle East, the Phoenicians, were establishing a lucrative trading network throughout the Mediterranean. In the 9th century BC, Phoenician merchants sailed to North Africa, lured by the promise of exotic goods from the heart of the continent. They established several coastal outposts, including one city-state destined to dominate the entire region, Carthage. The Carthaginians thrived by cultivating grains and olives along Africa's fertile shores, and they began their rise as a great commercial power by forming a trade alliance with the Garamantes.
There was a widespread trading network in the Sahara at this time, and the Garamantes appear to have been at the heart of it. And we know that they traded a range of commodities, for example, salt, oil, wine, and their capital, Garama, would have represented the hub of some of these trading routes.
The merchants traversing the Sahara in the first millennium BC traveled not by the camels that have since become a fixture here, but by horse. Horses could still hold their own in the few regions of the Sahara not fully consumed by desertification. The carts they pulled teemed with gold, ebony, ivory, and precious stones from Central Africa. The wealth generated by trans-Saharan trade helped Carthage to establish a vast commercial empire. By the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginians had become so powerful that they became a threat to the Mediterranean's new superpower, Rome. The two mighty rivals battled sporadically for more than a century in the protracted bloodfest known to history as the Punic Wars. Twice the Carthaginians were defeated. They were made subservient subjects of the empire, but many Roman officials, fearing Carthage would one day regain its prowess, demanded its annihilation. In 149 BC, the empire's legion stormed the shores of North Africa and laid siege to the city.
In an effort to appease the Romans, they had already surrendered all of their weapons, all of their siege engines, their navy, and so forth, and they weren't prepared to fight Romans or to withstand a siege.
Carthage's only hope was its formidable network of defensive walls. Some 21 miles of walls held Rome's legions at bay for 3 years. But all the while, food within the barricaded city became scarcer and scarcer. Many Carthaginians starved to death, and others became so desperate that they devoured the corpses of their comrades. Their nightmare deepened in 146 BC, when the tenacious Romans finally breached the walls. The empire's goal was not victory, but extermination.
What you see here is some of the rare, well-preserved ruins of Carthage, and this is a set of houses that was burned by the troops of Scipio Aemilian in 146 BC, when Rome decided to level forever this city.
The defenseless Carthaginians were as lambs to the slaughter.
The people tried to defend their houses, which are flanking these streets, and they were killed one after the other. A skeleton was found on this hill of a young man who tried to defend himself with a pan, a cooking pan, he used as a shield. This pan was pierced several times by a javelin, and the javelin was found in the pan by the body.
The Roman death squad surged methodically from house to house. Some 150,000 Carthaginians perished in one of history's greatest systematic executions of civilians before World War II.
The Roman army was moving through the streets, and behind it there were slaves that were grabbing the bodies with hooks and throwing them in trenches. Some of them were still alive. Some Carthaginians rather preferred to commit suicide in the flames rather than to surrender to the Romans.
The annihilation of Carthage marked the end of a vibrant and promising superpower. It enabled Rome to seize all of North Africa. The mighty empire now penetrated into the northern realms of the forbidding Sahara. Realizing that imperial might was no match for the desert's waterless expanses, the Romans drew a 2,000-mile line in the sand. Even they feared to cross. The Sahara's vastness virtually barred the passage of any major force hostile to Rome. But soldiers still manned a network of forts on the desolate frontier. Patrols set out from these outposts to maintain order along the desert trade routes. The ruins of one such outpost, called Tisavar, still stand in Tunisia. Built in AD 184, it was home to some 50 legionnaires.
Life for a Roman soldier on the Saharan frontier would have been pretty miserable. There was a lot of desert to cover, so you would have had forced marches across very, very barren, very dry desert in the baking sun with full armor, all your equipment. It would have been really, really unpleasant.
Must have been agony. But there were important trade routes that needed to be protected. So there was a continuous and actually increasing Roman presence on that border.
As the Romans patrolled the fringes of the desert, they also stepped up North Africa's agricultural output. By the 2nd century, North Africa's farmers helped them to develop a lucrative olive oil industry. At the oasis of Siwa in Egypt, 72-year-old Mohammed Kalani Said makes his living operating an olive press, much like those used by his ancestors, who toiled for the Romans 2,000 years ago.
This is how we pressed oil in the old days. Today, they have motor-driven mills. Some people like the manufactured oil, but others come asking for mine.
North African olive oil was exported throughout the empire as a dietary staple, washing agent, and lamp fuel. The Roman magnates who controlled the lucrative industry amassed riches beyond their dreams.
And within 100 or 150 years, this new industry that they'd actually created in this part of the world was capable of producing the wealth with which they constructed this edifice we have behind us.
The amphitheater in the city of El Jem in Tunisia once roared with the shouts of 35,000 spectators. It endures today as a monument to the empire's appetite for gory spectacle. Roman engineers labored for 8 years to build it, transporting sandstone blocks to the site from quarries 20 miles away. They completed the arena in AD 238. Here, gladiators, beasts, and condemned prisoners perished in the name of imperial entertainment.
When the game will start, they put the lions in cages and they go from this hall to arena by elevator. And for the gladiators, they go from the small steps there to the small door of arena. They push the gladiators, they close the door, and the game starts.
Rome continued to dominate North Africa for the next 4 centuries, but the western regions of the far-flung empire eventually crumbled, victims of their own declining institutions, the ill discipline and complacency of their armies, and marauding barbarians. In the 6th century, power passed to those controlling Rome's eastern territories, surrounding what is now Turkey, known as the Byzantine Empire. North Africa and the Sahara now belonged to them. By this time, nature had at last turned the Sahara into the sand-strewn sea of desolation we know today. A horse could no longer survive the sweltering trade routes to the northern coast, where Middle Eastern and European merchants eagerly awaited Africa's goods. But an extraordinary creature would emerge to continue the Sahara's march into history. By all appearances, it is living proof that evolution took a wrong turn. Its signature features are knobby knees, a humped back, an awkward gait, and a cranky disposition. Yet without the camel, the history of the Sahara would have taken a far different and infinitely less colorful course. The desert's distant past stirs to life regularly at the camel market in the Egyptian village of Berkash. Here, much like 1,000 years ago, buyers and sellers haggle over the most prized and obstinate beasts in the Sahara.
He's 5 years old. Look at the eyes. Look inside the mouth. Look at the teeth. Beautiful.
A lot of people say they're cantankerous and rather unpleasant beasts. Camels do spit, but it's not something I've ever had the misfortune to encounter, and they also bite. But I think they tend to do these things when they're treated inappropriately, mishandled, or perhaps approached when, for example, they're more interested in mating than they are in carrying luggage or humans.
The younger they are, the harder it is for you to tame them. They'll try to run away from you. If you are forceful with them, or if you hurt them, they may kick you to death.
At first glance, man and camel in the Sahara seem to be enemies bound in an unholy union, the bitter price each must pay to survive here. But in the serenity of a cool desert evening, a more complex relationship reveals itself, an interdependence that can foster affection. At home as camels seem here, they are not indigenous to the Sahara. They were imported from Southwest Asia in the 1st century AD. Still, nature engineered them ideally to navigate this sweltering vastness.
We call camels the ships of the desert. They're accustomed to the Sahara. It's their natural habitat.
The camel is fantastically well adapted to the desert environment. Everybody knows about the camel's hump, which is a sort of fatty deposit that enables it to store food so it can go for long periods when there's no pasture available. They have big, wide feet that stop them from sinking into soft desert sands. Camels have 2 eyelids on each eye. One of those eyelids is transparent, and so it enables them to keep the sand and the dust out of their eyes and still see where they're going, for example, in a sandstorm. So they're incredibly resilient.
By the 6th century, the camel had empowered the rise of a dominant new faction of indigenous tribes in North Africa, known collectively as the Berbers.
The word Berber comes from the Greek concept of barbarai, the barbarians. And they were not one people. These Berbers stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the limits of Egypt.
The Berbers took full advantage of the camel's adaptability and endurance to pioneer a vast new network of trade routes stretching from Central Africa to the Mediterranean. Nomads and merchants could now traverse distances deemed impossible during the age of the horse. Scattered along the network were the Sahara's verdant oases, the precious pockets of water and pasture that made travel across the vast desert feasible. These indispensable way stations were the salvation of camels and their handlers, driven to the brink of death on the scorching sands. Between the oases, merchants traveling the trade routes came to learn there was safety in numbers. They grouped together in caravans to guard against bands of ruthless desert thieves. The most feared raiders of all emerged from a fiercely independent Berber tribe called the Tuareg. Many Tuareg nomads roam the Sahara to this day, surviving just as their earliest ancestors did by herding cattle or conducting trade. But from the beginning, the Tuareg forged a chilling reputation as the Sahara's predators.
Their chief business was piracy, and what they wanted was to control the caravan roads where they extorted tolls and protection money from wealthy caravans, so there were good pickings. And if people didn't pay up, they just helped themselves.
Tuareg caravan raiders rarely charged in ambush. Their methods were more devious. They would befriend travelers and attach themselves to their procession. Then, after several days, they would isolate a lone victim, allowing his fellow merchants, who were powerless to help, to march on. The Tuareg's wealthy target then might be hacked to death by broadsword or strangled with a turban.
Much that we hear about the harshness of the Tuaregs and the heartlessness of the Tuaregs, probably it is justified. You cannot be a softy and survive in the environment of the Sahara Desert.
Their poetry and their legends all celebrate banditry, and that's why in the Tamashek language, the word to pillage and the word to be free are the same verb.
The principal thing of the code of honor that every outsider should know is if you say anything to make a Tuareg even touch the hilt of his sword, he has to draw blood with that sword.
Fearsome as they were, the Tuareg would be driven deeper into the Sahara by a menacing force that invaded North Africa in the 7th century. In the name of their god, they would rewrite the desert's history over the next 1,500 years. By the 7th century, the Sahara's indigenous tribes had made peace with the hostile desert they called home. Survival was still tenuous, but merchants could prosper if their camel caravans avoided the ravenous Tuareg. And farmers at the oases could harvest abundant crops of grains or dates as long as their wells teemed with water. But many a season witnessed the wells of villagers dry up and their crops wither. When that happened, the thirsty and the starving turned a desperate eye toward their neighbors across the dunes.
In periods of droughts, bigger tribes will attack smaller tribes, steal their food, their cattle. And in the desert, if you lose your food, one dies.
To protect and defend their precious supplies of grain, rival Berber tribes built what they called qusur. The qusur were massive mud fortresses perched strategically on high ground to help defenders repel any attack. This qusar in Tunisia, built in the 17th century, is the Sahara's best preserved example.
This structure that you see belongs to Oulad Sultan's tribe, which I am from. The tribe counted 400 members when the qusar was first built. Today, my tribe numbers over 8,000.
The architecture of the multi-tiered qusur was as ingenious as it was minimalist. To reach the upper levels, tribesmen ascended narrow winding staircases or gained footholds in cutouts or on outcroppings built into the facade. Each family in the Berber tribe was assigned several rooms, or ghorfas, where they stored their grain. The Sahara's low humidity, combined with the insulating effect of the mud walls, ensured that grain could be housed here for years without spoiling.
This handprint belongs to the man who built this chamber 400 years ago. These foot imprints were also made prior to building the structure. This triangular-shaped sign symbolized a productive year, while this one symbolized 2 consecutive productive years.
Beginning in the 7th century, the Berbers would retreat to the strategically situated qusur to defend against an enemy far more menacing than their own rival tribesmen. In the year 643, a horde of invaders from the east approached swiftly on the horizon. They were destined to seize the reins of history in the Sahara for the next millennium. Muslim warriors poured into North Africa from the Arabian Peninsula, overrunning the Berbers as well as the Byzantines, the heirs of the Roman Empire who still controlled the region. The Arabs' assault was not only in the name of territorial avarice, but also one in the name of God. Only 3 decades earlier, the birth of a powerful faith called Islam had rocked the Arab world. Inflamed by religious zeal, the advancing armies were on a holy mission to spread the Prophet Muhammad's newly revealed word. Across the Sahara, Berber rebels took refuge in the Qasr. High atop strongholds like Qasr Chanini in Tunisia, they began to plot a desperate campaign of resistance.
Even today, as one has to wind their way up a circuitous route by foot to get to the hilltop, just imagine years ago how difficult it would have been for invading tribes to reach that. It provided a safeguard being so remote and so difficult to reach, and as a result, this isolation preserved their Berber culture.
When the outnumbered Berber rebels emerged from the safety of the Qasr to challenge the Arab invaders, they suffered setback after setback. Just as their cause seemed lost, a charismatic new leader emerged from their ranks to rally them. The chief of a tribe called the Jarawa was a gifted seer, a fervent patriot, and a mother of 2. She is remembered simply as Al-Kahina.
Now, the word kahina comes from the Arabic for sorceress or prophetess, so obviously she had some sort of spiritual, some sort of mystical claim to authority. The different tribespeoples coalesced around her leadership and formed a military organization capable of defeating the Arab conquest in the field.
Led by Al-Kahina, the Berber rebels counterattacked and drove the Arab marauders thousands of miles east, across North Africa and back into Egypt. But realizing the Arabs would soon return, Al-Kahina devised a desperate plan she hoped would save her people. Believing that the Arabs would lose interest in North Africa if there were much less to plunder, she ordered her followers to burn many of their cities and uproot many of their crops.
However, this turned out to be a disastrous policy on 2 accounts. For one, it failed to recognize that the Arabic conquest was motivated religiously. These people were looking for converts. They weren't averse to some loot and plunder, but that wasn't the reason they were coming to North Africa. The second point was, by destroying the cities, by wiping out the settled areas, she managed to alienate those people who had previously supported her.
When the tenacious Arabs flooded back into Tunisia, Al-Kahina could no longer muster the forces necessary to repel them. She and her freedom fighters were finally cornered within the imposing walls of the amphitheater of El Jem.
The Arabic invaders hacked their way into the Colosseum, slaughtering all that stood in their way as they tried to get to the Kahina, whittling down to the remains of her band as they approached her. It's unclear from the ancient accounts whether or not she was killed in this initial struggle or whether she was taken prisoner and later executed. But in any case, we are told that her corpse was identified, her body beheaded, and her head was sent to the Caliph in Baghdad as evidence that this last resistance to the conquest of North Africa had been overcome.
As the 8th century dawned, North Africa belonged to the Arabs. With the same zeal with which they seized the land, they continued their sacred mission to spread their revolutionary faith. Since the 7th century, a Muslim crier called a muezzin has called the pious to prayer at the great mosque of Kairouan in Tunisia. The mosque is now revered as one of Islam's most holy sites. The original structure and the city surrounding it were built in 670 by the Arab conqueror Uqba bin Nafi, just 4 decades after the death of Muhammad.
He settled here alone with his soldiers and horses. He soon noticed that his horses would travel a far distance to urinate or defecate. So he took this as a sign that the place was sacred. This room could hold up to 6,000 people. Besides being a place for prayer, it was a university where teachers, scholars, doctors, and seekers of knowledge met.
During the Arab invasion, the Muslim marauders had spread Islam along Africa's northern coast as they had in its birthplace in Arabia, at the point of a sword. They gave the Berbers two choices: convert or die. But extending their faith into the forbidding desert demanded a subtler strategy.
Islam came, in a sense, with a camel. It came through trade. The trade routes created an environment for the transmission of this religion, which, as we should remember, is a world religion. And for people in the southern part of the Sahara, people, in fact, throughout the Sahara, the Islamic religion was a way of connecting themselves spiritually as well as economically to a much larger world.
As Islam solidified its place in the Sahara during the Middle Ages, so did lavish kingdoms born of the desert's thriving trade routes. One sparkling metropolis would rise as the Sahara's jewel, only to be targeted by the cruel hand of fate. At the southern rim of the Sahara stands a humble city that offers few hints of its former glory. 700 years ago, it was a thriving metropolis. It is now one of the poorest places on Earth. To walk its streets, however, is to sense its potent allure as one of civilization's most isolated pockets of humanity. Its name has become a byword for remoteness. This is Timbuktu. The renowned oasis city, founded in the 12th century, is located in what is now Mali. It sprang up at the precise point where the Niger River flowed northward into the southern edge of the Sahara, the ideal crossroad on the trans-Saharan trade route, where the desert's camels could meet the savannah's canoes. Timbuktu's lifeblood was the abundant water flowing in its subterranean springs. With plenty to drink and plenty to trade, the city thrived as the gateway for Central Africa's goods, bound for Mediterranean merchants and the courts of Europe. At its bustling bazaar, Saharan traders had their pick of the continent's gold, ivory, fine clothes, and exquisite jewelry. The city that today is an unimpressive array of mud buildings was once the jewel of the Sahara. Home to 100,000, Timbuktu was not only the desert's commercial capital, but also the spiritual and intellectual nucleus of great Islamic kingdoms that emerged on the southern rim of the desert.
It was a very vibrant place, a very cosmopolitan place. It was very urbane. People from so many different cultures lived there and worked there together. It was very multicultural.
Though one of the most remote sites on Earth, Timbuktu gained renown as an elite storehouse of advanced written knowledge. In 80 private libraries, scholars wrote and studied manuscripts ranging from geography to chemistry to physics. Only a fraction of these medieval manuscripts survive in Timbuktu, but for Islamic scholar Ali Oud Sidi and countless other Africans, their value is incalculable.
It's a treasure, and it's also a proof showing that as Africans we had a past. not only a traditional, an oral tradition, but also writing sources. That's very important for us.
The heart of Timbuktu's intellectual prowess was Sankore University. Now a mosque, it was founded in 1325. As many of Europe's fledgling universities were struggling to gain credibility during the Renaissance, Sankore had already established itself as one of civilization's consummate centers of learning.
To give you an idea how knowledge was really tough at the Sankore University, we discovered a manuscript. And that manuscript is dealing with algebra, mathematics. We translate it into French. We send it to France to evaluate level. The same program is given to the second year of university in France. And that program was given here at the University of Sankore by the 16th century.
Timbuktu prospered by using the Sahara as both protection from invaders and a portal through which it could transport desirable goods from the African interior to merchants on the Mediterranean coast. Trade caravans had carried Central Africa's gold across the desert since the days of the Romans. But during the Middle Ages, the volume skyrocketed. A staggering 2 to 3 tons of gold traversed the stifling Sahara each year. In 1324, Mali's greatest emperor, Mansa Musa, assembled what was perhaps the most immense gold-bearing caravan in history. His procession was not a commercial enterprise, but a sacred pilgrimage. From Timbuktu, Mansa Musa led some 30,000 camels into the burning Sahara toward the holy city of Mecca. According to medieval accounts, they were burdened with silks, jewels, and some 30,000 pounds of gold, an amount that today would equal more than $130 million. As Mansa Musa passed through Egypt, he gave away much of it to the citizens along his route.
The ruler of Mali astonished all of the Middle East by the amount of gold he brought with him. So much gold that he actually destabilized the economy of Egypt for a decade afterwards. He was so free with his gold that the economy went into a recession after he left.
Another treasure powering the Saharan trade routes lay hidden a few tantalizing feet beneath the sun-scorched sands. Salt was the one precious commercial product found in the Great Desert itself. 450 miles north of Timbuktu, near the town of Taoudeni, salt miners carry on a timeless process pioneered by their ancestors. Workers cut 80-pound blocks from the Sahara's ancient lake beds. A necessity for human life, salt was, and still is, critically scarce in the region south of the desert. During the Middle Ages, it was literally worth its weight in gold. To this day, salt caravans from Taoudeni make an arduous 2-week, 450-mile trek south to Timbuktu. Although salt and gold were immensely profitable in the Sahara, another commodity stood alone as the most prized of all. Slaves from the African interior represented half the value of the desert's commercial traffic. South of the Sahara, Arab merchants found a booming ready-made slave market. For slavery had been an accepted institution in Central Africa for centuries. Tribes acquired slaves by the thousands in raids and wars, and their owners were often eager to sell them to Muslim traders for European guns, gunpowder, and fabrics. long processions of captives linked by chains and neck shackles trudged across the burning Sahara. Most of the slaves were women who were to become concubines and domestic servants in North Africa and the Middle East.
The process by which the slaves were moved by way of the Sahara Desert is truly one of the most disturbing and gruesome stories history has to tell. When people on this hideous death march could not go on, the chronicles tell us that oftentimes they were simply beheaded, and so that the empty neck shackle was assigned to other slaves that they had to carry on, or otherwise they would also have to suffer this horrible fate.
On many of the caravan routes, the route was actually marked by the bleached bones of people who had died in transit, and only the toughest people would have been able to survive this crossing of the Sahara.
Over the centuries, some 9 million captives traversed the scorching sands. As many as half perished along the way. By the 16th century, Timbuktu and the lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes were controlled by Africa's dominant power, the Songhai Empire. Ruling a region which now includes the nation of Mali, the Songhai were descended from 8th century Berbers who had settled south of the Sahara along the Niger River. Under their dominion, Timbuktu attained the pinnacle of its glory. The Songhai had amassed unprecedented wealth, but their prosperity finally made them a target of their neighbors. For centuries, the Songhai had relied on the Sahara as their impenetrable defense. Then in 1591, more than 1,000 miles to the north, the covetous kingdom of Morocco launched a daring invasion. 4,000 soldiers marched across the desert toward Timbuktu. More than 2 months later, they swarmed into the city. They plundered its gold and kidnapped its scholars. A once shining metropolis and core of an enlightened empire was now a ravaged blemish on the edge of the Sahara. Timbuktu's collapse was assured when Portuguese mariners dealt a critical blow to its economic lifeline, the trans-Saharan trade route to the Mediterranean. They pioneered a more efficient route by sea. West Africa's resources could now be transported by cargo ships sailing from the Atlantic coast to Europe's ports. As Timbuktu decayed in the centuries that followed, its mystique and the Saharas lived on. In the era to come, the desert would lure adventurers from faraway lands, including 8 American Marines, on a perilous mission to the shores of Tripoli. By the dawn of the 19th century, the glory days of Timbuktu and the trans-Saharan trading empires were long gone. But the vast desert was about to witness bold new dramas ignited by a surge of foreign adventurers. The first and most improbable episode of this era was authored by none other than the United States Marines. The year was 1805. Their mission was daunting: to launch a surprise attack in America's first war on terror. The circumstances that brought them here form one of the most intriguing chapters in United States history. For centuries, the pirate nations of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers had seized merchant ships in the Mediterranean and extorted huge ransoms for the release of their crews. By 1801, President Thomas Jefferson and the fledgling United States had agreed to pay the pirates $2 million to release scores of American captives, an amount greater than the entire defense budget of the nation.
Jefferson said that he despised paying extortion money to the Barbary pirates. But Jefferson paid Tunis, Algiers, and then he just dragged his feet a little on paying Tripoli. So Tripoli actually declared war on us in 1801, the first foreign nation ever to declare war on the United States.
Jefferson was outraged. He ordered 4 warships to the Mediterranean to patrol the North African coast and bombard Tripoli. But with no ground troops, he had little hope of winning the war. Then came William Eaton, America's hot-headed and charismatic consul to Tunis. He arrived in Egypt after winning congressional approval for what many deemed a reckless plot certain to fail.
Eaton was a complicated character, but above all, he was an enormous patriot. He adored the United States, and he was deeply, deeply angry that the Barbary pirates would dare demand money from us or enslave our people.
Outside Alexandria, Eaton gathered a mismatched rabble made up of some 300 Arab Muslims and 75 European Christians. Spearheading the force would be 8 Marines recruited from the naval gunships patrolling offshore. Eaton's audacious plan was to conquer Tripoli, replacing its tyrannical leader Yusuf Karamanli with his exiled brother, Hamet.
And it was America's first covert op. We had never done this before. It was almost insane. It was so ambitious.
Step 1 in Eaton's strategy was to march 520 miles and capture one of Tripoli's most heavily defended cities, Derna. On March 8, 1805, his invasion force began its arduous trek. From the outset, it teetered on the brink of collapse.
These guys were ready to kill each other. Every 3rd or 4th day, it was the Europeans versus the Arabs. It was just a recipe for disaster, and it blew up 5 or 6 times along the trip.
These Arab troops were not particularly well disciplined, so apparently the Marines had to virtually hold them at gunpoint to keep the whole force together and marching in the right direction.
After a brutal march of 48 days, Eaton's exhausted soldiers finally reached Derna. Outnumbered 10 to 1, their formidable task was to overwhelm 1,000 entrenched defenders behind Derna's walls. 3 U.S. naval ships arrived to support them from the harbor. Derna's shore batteries fired the first shots. The American sailors answered with a devastating bombardment. At the same time, Eaton launched the land assault. Derna's defenders answered with an unrelenting barrage of musket fire that stalled the advance. His motley force began to disintegrate.
And Eaton makes a dramatic decision about 3:30 in the afternoon. He's going to charge. He figures he can get his 100 men down the hill, and they can maybe get off one clean shot at him, and then he'll get to the bottom, and they'll panic and they'll run. So it's typical Eaton, typical bravado, borderline insane, but, you know, it could work.
Eaton and Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon led the ragtag force in a mad dash straight toward Derna's guns. A musket ball tore through Eaton's wrist. Another shot struck a Marine in the heart, killing him instantly. A second Marine fell mortally wounded. But after the defenders fired their initial volley, they panicked just as Eaton had hoped and fled deeper into the city.
Lieutenant O'Bannon keeps right on running with midshipmen at his side. They go straight to the fort in the harbor, and they raise the American flag over the fort in Derna, which is the first time the Stars and Stripes have ever flown in victory outside of the Americas.
The heroic presence of Marines in Derna, in fact, gave rise to one of the lines in the Marine hymn. Of course, we know from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Derna.
The smoke had barely cleared over Derna, however, when Eaton and the Marines received a stunning message.
What they discovered was that the Americans and the government in Tripoli had signed a peace before this had ever happened. So this whole expedition in fact, was totally unnecessary.
Unable to support the cost of the war, Jefferson had turned to diplomacy. The two sides exchanged prisoners, and with a final payment of $60,000, the president secured a pledge that no further tribute would be exacted from the American government.
The good news is that the ruler of Tripoli was terrified about what Eaton had done, and he very much rushed into a peace treaty and gave us a bargain price because of William Eaton's capture of Derna.
The Marines' swashbuckling adventure 200 years ago gave Saharans a taste of turbulent things to come in the 19th century. After the Americans departed, another foreign power would invade the Great Desert, with dreams of making the Sahara its own. The Sahara of the mid-19th century was a vast domain, largely untouched by the world beyond its horizons. The tribes clustered at its oases, and the nomads wandering its dunes lived just as their ancestors did centuries in the past. Here, time had stood still. But across the Mediterranean, Europe was convulsing with change. Its restless nations, bloodied by the Napoleonic Wars, were now stepping up their rivalry in colonial expansion. France set its sights on the Sahara. The desert offered little beyond its colossal acreage, but its power vacuum made it enticing. The impossible task of seizing and maintaining control of the Sahara would fall on a hard-boiled force of soldiers as gritty as the desert sands, the French Foreign Legion. The force destined to become a legend began as a dumping ground. Thousands of veterans from Europe's battlegrounds had taken refuge in the saloons and side streets of France. Many drifted without purpose or scruples.
These people became very much of a nuisance in France. The French did not like them because of in many cases because of their political leanings, because they were refugees, because they were out of work, because they might resort to crime. So what better expedient than to gather these people up into a military unit, which was called the Légion étrangère, and get them out of the country. So they shipped these people to North Africa where they could benefit the French Empire.
Over the next century, the Foreign Legion staked France's claim to the Sahara by patrolling a vast region stretching from Morocco to Algeria to Tunisia. Here, the Legionnaires waged two grueling wars, one against Arab, Berber, and Tuareg rebels who refused to submit to their authority, and another against the forbidding Sahara.
If you were looking for a place where you could be challenged, then Sahara was the place for you. I can't think of another battlefield in the world where men could survive days of marching in 110 degrees Fahrenheit plus heat and then freeze to death at night.
In the public imagination, the Sahara of the Foreign Legion was a sand-swept purgatory where men with tarnished pasts sought redemption through danger, or where the heartbroken could forget a lost love. In reality, most soldiers who trudged here were men with ordinary pasts faced with an extraordinary challenge. Grizzled sergeants tested their stamina and spirit with grueling training exercises.
The Legion became famous for its ability to march long distances. 20 miles a day was not unusual, with full pack that's 80 pounds plus of gear in this tremendous heat. In the course of training, some people, of course, didn't measure up right away. If you fell out and you continued to fall out, you'd likely get tied to the back of a cart by a pole, and you could either stand up and keep moving or be dragged over the rocks, over the sand, until you decided whether you were going to march or die.
This torture, reserved for soldiers willing but unable to keep pace with their comrades, paled in comparison with the abuses suffered by malingerers who shirked their duties.
you might be subjected to a form of punishment called the crapodine. What it involved was tying a soldier's hands tightly behind his back, tying his ankles, and then hooking up the tied hands and the ankles, bending your back into a really awkward, tortured position. And you might be left in that position for hours.
The tortures legionnaires endured at the hands of their own commanders toughened them for their grueling war with the Sahara's native tribes. On April 26, 1882, the Legion and the desert's insurgents would clash in perhaps their most dramatic battle of all. The setting was a desolate valley in present-day Morocco called Chatigri. In a blinding sandstorm, 3 companies of legionnaires were escorting a surveying team that had been mapping the region. Suddenly, through the stinging mist, flooded an army of Arab horsemen. The bewildered legionnaires scrambled to assemble a defensive square, a tactical formation designed to repel an enemy assault from any direction.
A square is probably the best kind of defense against cavalry there is. Now, they still can't see very well. All they know is that this enemy is coming at them.
Only when the storm briefly subsided did the French realize the nightmarish scope of their predicament. Charging toward their modest force of 300 men were nearly 8,000 Arabs.
And the legionnaires are up against it. I mean, if they try to break this square, if they try to get away, they're going to be caught in the open and killed.
But this chilling reality was already playing itself out. Dozens of mule-mounted legionnaires, blinded by the wind-swept sands, had been unable to find their way to the defensive square.
The poor legionnaires who got caught in the open at Chatigri and had to fight for muleback paid a very heavy price. Almost all of them died either in the fighting or when they tried to mount a defense from behind their slaughtered mounts.
The Arabs launched charge after charge, but each was repulsed by the Legion's disciplined fire. Finally, after 7 hours, the frustrated Arabs retreated, and the Battle of Chatigri was over. 2,000 Arab corpses littered the sands. The Legion's dead numbered 42. 31 were wounded. 1 officer survived with 16 separate wounds, 9 by bullet and 7 by sword.
I think on both sides there was an incredible amount of determination and bravery, and this is quite a classic Saharan engagement. "23 years after this fateful skirmish, in 1905, the Foreign Legion forced the last of the Sahara's insurgent tribes to submit to French rule.
So the French finally conquered the Sahara, but having got the Sahara, well, what are you going to do with it? They discovered that it has no value whatsoever. All of this effort has gone in to conquering the Sahara, and in the end, it brings the French very little value.
Even so, France would cling tenaciously to its colonies in North Africa until 1962. Throughout the 20th century, foreign powers would continue to author epic dramas in the Sahara. During the Second World War, 2 rival forces would wage a desperate struggle, not only against each other, but also the hostile desert. At the port city of Tobruk in Libya lie the fallen soldiers of the last great war in the Sahara. Here and across North Africa, the Allies and the Axis fought one of the most pivotal campaigns of World War II. Their struggle was not simply a contest of firepower and tactics. It was also a fight for survival in the hostile desert. In 1941, the British were dueling the German and Italian armies, taking turns driving each other hundreds of miles across Libya. Their battleground was the same vast stretch where the American Marines marched toward Tripoli 137 years earlier. The Germans' and Italians' objective was Egypt's Suez Canal, the strategic shortcut through which Britain brought manpower and resources from its colonial possessions to the battlefields of Europe. Beyond the canal lay the oil fields of the Middle East, the major source of Allied fuel.
For the Allies, this war in North Africa was of paramount importance because if the Germans and Italians took the Suez Canal, the British lost much of their hold on the Near East. The oil would be lost. This would have been a catastrophe for the Allies.
Vexing the British at every turn was the German Afrika Korps' daring and crafty commander, General Erwin Rommel. Because he applied Germany's brand of blitzkrieg warfare brilliantly in the Sahara, he earned the nickname Desert Fox.
What the Sahara has for Rommel is sort of wide open spaces. It allows maneuver. And this is what the blitzkrieg is based on. Fighting in the desert is almost like fighting at sea. In other words, you've got these tank armies that are maneuvering among sort of islands of infantry that are holding fixed positions. It's a very sort of mobile type of warfare that the Germans, of course, excel at.
The Sahara may have been uniquely suited for waging war, but it was also a hellish arena that tormented both sides.
Imagine, if you will, being buttoned up inside a tank. Inside tanks, temperatures routinely rose well above 130 degrees. That is at the very limit of what human beings could endure.
Outside the sweltering tanks, infantry soldiers were bedeviled by a different agony.
There was a wind called a khamsin that used to blow up from the interior, and the only way to survive a khamsin storm was basically to sit tight and hunker down. They'd feel as if they were on the verge of being driven mad by that.
The British were very badly adapted. If you see pictures of this period, you realize that they all wear shorts. People loathed the shorts because when you got in a sandstorm, the sand would whip your legs, and people would just have their legs raw by the sand.
Dust and sand presented for maintenance officers a great nightmare. Dust that would clog engines, filters. In fact, both armies had to develop special dust filters for their aircraft and tanks.
It jams machine guns, it jams tank turrets. Everything, all food has sand in it. You just get used to chewing sand the whole time.
Allied and Axis soldiers alike forgot the torments of the desert as the war in North Africa took a dramatic turn. In June 1942, Rommel rampaged 800 miles east, driving the outfoxed British deep into Egypt. The Germans closed to within 80 miles of the prize they sought, the Suez Canal. But here, near El Alamein, dwindling supplies of fuel and water forced them to halt their advance. The respite gave the British time to reinforce their troops and to ready a new strategy plotted by a charismatic new commander. General Bernard Montgomery was their last hope to turn the tide.
Montgomery did something that was very difficult to do by that third year of the war for British troops. He inspired them. These guys were cynics. They'd seen leaders come and go, and they had been hammered by the Germans. Montgomery took command of that army and turned it around.
In August 1942, Montgomery set up defenses taking strategic advantage of one of the Sahara's most distinctive features. He positioned the British forces north of the Qattara Depression, a mammoth sinkhole of impassable sand. Covering 7,500 square miles and plunging 435 feet below sea level, it is one of the lowest spots in Africa. the impenetrable depression would make it impossible for Rommel to use his favorite tactic, outflanking the British from the south.
On the night of the 23rd of October 1942, the British artillery opened a colossal barrage. And behind this line of shells, which would advance at the fixed rate of 100 yards every 2 minutes, would come the British infantry.
The German defenders were pummeled by this artillery fire. Some of them, of course, blown to bloody showers, and the survivors in their foxholes would not have time to recover their wits before the British infantry was in amongst them.
So for the next 5 or 6 days, Rommel was bringing reinforcements up from the south and elsewhere to try and regain the ground that had been lost. And this formed what Montgomery called the crumbling battle, where he wanted these reserves to come up because he could then destroy them with concentrated artillery and air power.
At El Alamein, Rommel's army suffered a defeat the dimensions of which they had never experienced. Half of his 100,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured.
Montgomery's battle at El Alamein was so well planned and so well executed that it cost the Germans, of their tank force of 460, it cost them all but 11.
As the Germans flooded back toward Tunisia, the noose tightened. 107,000 American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. In May 1943, after months of bitter combat, the Axis forces finally surrendered. 275,000 were taken prisoner. The war in the Sahara was over. Today, 60 years later, the Sahara is playing host to a different kind of war. Engineers armed with 21st century technology are waging a titanic battle to tame the hostile desert. The Sahara of the 21st century faces an uncertain future. A modern society is struggling to emerge in an ancient landscape. The harsh desert environment stands in the people's way. Challenges darken the horizon like a gathering sandstorm.
Even today, the Sahara Desert is changing. It is expanding northward, and is getting closer and closer to the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The Arab-speaking countries and the Berber-speaking countries in northern Africa, they are facing a very, very harsh reality for the future.
As the Sahara creeps north, many of its fragile oases are succumbing to the ravages of pollution, and many of its scattered wells are drying up.
In the early 1800s, where you would have wells that were no more than 8, 12, 15 feet deep, you're now having to go down 200, 300, 400 feet to reach the same aquifers, and that water table is still dropping.
Although the Sahara's aquifers continue to diminish, a wealth of subterranean water still remains. Many residents believe their only hope to survive is to use technology's might to tap it on an industrial scale. Libya has recently completed a $25 billion pipeline that pumps water to its thirsty citizens on the coast. Stretching 250 miles, it taps the vast Nubian sandstone aquifer that lies beneath Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan. The subway-sized pipes carry hundreds of millions of gallons of water to Tripoli each week. The pipeline, known as the Great Man-Made River, is one of the largest civil engineering projects on Earth, but it worries many experts.
The important thing about the water resources in the Sahara is that they're fossil water resources. They're not being replenished. If you look at the groundwater in the subterranean aquifers, we're effectively talking about mining water. This water was put there many, many thousands of years ago, so it's a scarce and finite resource, and once it's gone, it's gone.
As the great man-made river empties the Sahara's aquifers, another environmental issue is also alarming experts. The desert's most remote oases are withering along the ancient trading routes. The town of Arawan, 180 miles north of Timbuktu, is more than 900 years old. It was once a thriving way station, inhabited by 3,000. It is now home to just 125. Local legend holds that Arawan took its name from a tribal dialect. It means water hauled up on a rope. The village's wells still hold ample water for its people to survive. But for the past half-century, the town has faced a crisis more insidious than any water shortage. Like a nightmare in slow motion, the wind-blown sand surrounding Arawan have been swallowing up the village. Such is the natural order of things in the Sahara.
It's quite common to find areas where dunes have crept over houses and into villages, and there are villages that have had to be moved successively to keep ahead of the advancing dunes. And this is something that people certainly do have to cope with.
In 1988, Arawan's citizens made a valiant effort to clear away the relentless sands and reclaim their village. The endeavor was spearheaded by the unlikeliest of volunteers. 2 visitors to the Sahara, Manhattan artist Ernst Abbey and his wife Emily, made it their mission to save the dying village.
At the height of the project, it was incredible. We had the garden that was producing fruits and vegetables. We had 2 schools with 2 teachers, and we had a night school for the women. We had a hotel with guests that were coming from as far away as Bamako and from Timbuktu. It was a beautiful little utopia in the middle of the Sahara.
But within just a few years, the renewed oasis paradise proved powerless against the Sahara's relentless winds and the onslaughts of sand they carried.
So everybody was very happy. And they became our friends, and it was a very beautiful place to be. And now everything's gone. We're sitting in what was the courtyard, or well, it still is the courtyard of the hotel, but the desert is taken over. One of the schools is completely buried in sand. The other school is partially buried. Our house is gone. There's not even a trace of what once was a very happy place.
As the people of Arawan and countless others look with grave doubts to the future, other Saharans cling tenaciously to the past. In the village of Mopti in Mali, workers still export salt that's mined in the desert, just as it was during the Middle Ages. But industrial salt production has ravaged their livelihood. Experts estimate that their time-honored business is worth just $750,000 per year, 1/4 of what it was 15 years ago. The camel drivers who still haul the salt from the remote salt beds to Timbuktu see their profession withering as well. They cannot compete with truck convoys, which carry far more and take just 3 days instead of 2 weeks. Such convoys and most of the Sahara's auto traffic still lumber overland across the dunes and salt flats. But workers in Algeria are struggling to change that. For more than 30 years, they've been laboring to complete a massive project aptly called the Trans-Saharan Highway. Designers envision a 2-lane ribbon of paved roadway that will stretch 3,000 miles, linking Nigeria with the Algerian coast. Branches will extend to the far-flung reaches of Chad, Mali, and Tunisia. But in several regions along the route, the highway faces the same monumental problem as Erewhon. The Sahara's ever-shifting dunes are swallowing up the construction team's handiwork. The encroaching sands threaten to extinguish the dream of travelers and goods traversing a more commercially viable Africa. Will modern engineering thrust the Sahara and its people into a prosperous new era? Or will nature finally expel man from this majestic desolation? Whatever the Sahara's future, its mystique will endure. Sinister and seductive, mythic and mysterious, as tantalizing and elusive as a mirage.